What is happening, everyone? Coach Ishak with HawkFit Coaching and Legion Athletics, and your host for today's episode of Anabolic Radio. I'm joined today by Sharelle Grant, and if you're unfamiliar with Sharelle, I definitely recommend you go, give her a follow on all social medias, and just, go through a quick dive of her timeline, see what she's about, everything she does, and without further ado, the floor is yours, Sharelle. I want to go ahead and first dive off with, an introduction of your background, give the audience, just a brief insight, become a bit more familiar with yourself.
Yeah, thanks for the intro. It's a pleasure to be here. I love jumping on podcasts and being able to share, I guess, my story and what got me into the fitness space as well. So I guess a bit of a background is I worked for about 7 or 8 years as a nurse and a midwife, and that really got me quite interested to health and fitness as a whole. So I was working sort of nursing and midwifery, and I was sort of training, like lifting weights on the side and getting right into my, I guess, fitness career as well. And throughout that time, like with my nursing background and my midwifery background, I guess my passion started to go more into the fitness space and the fitness industry as well. And I started to get quite interested into bodybuilding and like lifting weights and building my physique, because as we were having a conversation earlier, I think a lot of women get into the gym with that cardio bunny sort of background, wanting to just be skinnier. And for me, I went through like this whole history of being in that cardio bunny space and then getting curious about whether there was a better way to be able to build my body up and look after my health and fitness as a whole. So I obviously have a competing background, which you know me through social media, and I share quite a bit about my competing history on that. And I've been able to really, I guess, advance my own training knowledge to be able to let go a lot of the myths and the backgrounds of what I once did. But my history is so long. So where do you even want to start?
Okay. Where do we want to start? So let's go ahead and start off when you had first gotten started into health and fitness. What were some of those initial thoughts or reasons that pushed you to actually get your foot in the gym?
Well, I guess when I first started actually getting interested in fitness, I actually entered the fitness space with running. So I think I got a Garmin watch for Christmas one year, and I started running, just, beating times, building up to being able to do 5K, 6K, 7K. And that was actually really good for me because it showed me performance. And that was my first introduction to getting quicker, getting faster, improving times, rather than just like focusing on burning calories, for example. So I got right into running for a period of time. And through that, I started to get like some little niggles and some injuries. And my physio at the time sort of recommended that I get into the gym and start lifting some weights to complement my running. So that's what initially got me into strength training. And as I went through, I guess, a lot of the resistance training programs that I was doing, I just saw my body change so much. And I think we're sort of sold this image to, build the body that you want. You sort of have to be less of you. You have to eat less. You have to do more cardio. You have to do this sort of way of living. But it was actually through the resistance training where I was like, oh, I'm actually building shape. I'm building muscle. I'm learning. I'm enjoying getting stronger in the gym. And then slowly over time, I sort of let go of the running and just started lifting more. And I, naturally found myself scrolling through bodybuilding.com and T Nation and just getting hungry to learn more. But that was probably 5 or 6 years ago now, and it was such a masculine space. Bodybuilding.com did not have a female section, for example. So I was reading a lot of the training principles that was very masculine, and I just, from that, made me sort of curious to be like, are women different? Is there a different way of doing it? Why are we still fed all the bullshit of like being on the cross trainer or like 1,200 calorie diets, whereas men are sort of getting a different image of how to change their body? So I think going through that transition from running like group training fitness classes to then actually lifting in a gym and collecting that evidence for myself, that's actually what sort of pushed me into the bodybuilding space to be like, how much further can I push my physique, and how much further can I, advance myself through a more optimal way of doing things.
So you said obviously you had a competition background. So how many times have you competed now?
I want to say 9. I've done 9 or 10 shows. Sorry.
How many seasons? Like a season counting like a year of competition.
Yeah, so I think I've done about, I want to say 4 or 5 seasons. Probably 4. So the first season I did like 3 shows in the space of sort of like 3 months. And I feel like that's quite common when you're amateur. You sort of just back it up because it's your first time going, and you usually come in a bit better. So I did quite a few years of quite a few seasons of consecutive shows at the start. And then that sort of led me to the WBFF, which is the federation that I compete with now.
Okay, for sure. Awesome. So I'm sure, when you were going through your more amateur seasons, you were obviously, having some guidance or working with some coaches and not throwing anyone under the bus. But I'm sure, you experienced or you've heard some stories. I know we probably could exchange so many horror stories of like, different things that women had to go through to get to the stage, or maybe, things that you've gone through personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, but it's really interesting that you say that. When I first started competing, I actually didn't have a coach. I sort of really wanted to do it on my own, which I look back now and I say it's not the best decision. I wouldn't encourage that. I strongly advocate for coaching and mentors in your life to be able to get the most optimal result rather than suffering for the sake of it. But back then I didn't even know comp prep coaches existed, really. I just sort of winged it, did my own research, and I'm so incredibly grateful that I did do that, because I made a lot of mistakes, and it sort of has shaped a lot of the beliefs that I have now. In saying that, I've had several different coaches, and like what you said, never throwing anyone under the bus. You learn the things that you want to do, and you also learn the things that you probably wouldn't do yourself again, or take into your own coaching practice, for example. But I often share, I'm very open about saying, I've done all the things. I've eaten, 1,200 calories. I've done the waist trainers. I've done keto. I've done HIIT. Like, I've trialed and errored almost like every fad diet under the sun. And it's great because it gives me really good perspective of, I guess, a lot of the information that is bled out through social media still.
Mm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great points. And I don't want to go off and say I did waist trainers and 1,200 calorie diets, because that would be a lie. But, I'm sure I've gone through like similar things with regards to just figuring out what works best for me, and I feel like I wouldn't be in a position to excel in what I do today if it hadn't been through, or if it hadn't been for that trial and error phase and going through experience. Something I always like to say is experience is the biggest teacher, right? And it heals insecurities, and it teaches you what you need to be doing right or what you need to be doing wrong. It helps you develop protocols, just a system. And that's just to become more strategic about overall progress and the big picture of things, right? But so something we previously just covered is that, when you were scrolling on bodybuilding.com, you had been seeing this more masculine way to structure training. I'm sure it was like along the line of like every set to failure, or like, veins popping out of biceps and whatnot. But anyways, that was like old bodybuilding.com that nowadays. I'm not sure how it is nowadays, but anyways, obviously we know there are significant differences physiologically, anatomically, hormonally with regards to males and females. So let's go ahead and we're going to dive into that rabbit hole, and let's just first cover the most important one, which is the menstrual cycle, and how females could adapt their training and their nutrition based on what phase they're at in their menstrual cycle.
Yeah, so like, it's such a massive topic, and it's very nuanced, I guess, talking about the menstrual cycle and how that does alter a female's nutrition and training. But something I like to sort of have full disclosure with is saying that if you're sort of on hormonal contraception or if you don't have a regular menstrual cycle, a lot of the information that you might read may not actually be completely relevant as well. And this is why, like in my own coaching, business, it's so individualized. Do you know what I mean? Like the same information, you can't generalize it to everyone, but there is a general guideline of like, well, if you're textbook normal, this is what you might experience, but making sure that we tune into our own body and listen to that throughout, the fluctuations that you may have. So I guess just starting, the menstrual cycle is made up of two dominant phases. You've got your follicular phase and then your luteal phase. And I made a diagram that you've mentioned that you've shared as well to be able to really break down what this looks like over the course of the month. But I really just simply say, it's a push phase and a pull phase. Like for the first 2 weeks of your cycle from day one, which is when you first bleed from day one of your cycle, you can usually push a lot harder in your training. So endurance will peak up, strength will peak up, and this goes all the way through until like ovulation. And for those who don't know, ovulation is sort of when like the egg is released and you're fertile, and they call it like your fertile window. So for the first 2 weeks of your cycle, personally, what I find, and a lot of my own female clients, is that we have more strength and endurance in the gym. We can push a lot harder, and that's because of those hormonal changes that are happening, estrogen, progesterone, as well as testosterone sort of peaking in that time. But then what a lot of women will be able to tune into is, I guess, the luteal phase or PMS, and that's when you might experience, I guess, feeling a bit flat. Cravings will ramp up. You might have less energy, more fatigued. And this is almost when I say to a lot of my clients, like, if you need to pull back the week before your period, like listen to your body and do that. Don't feel like you need to fight your physiology and push hard through it. And this is a really interesting concept, I think, for a lot of coaches to understand, because it sort of goes against like linear periodization and in looking at, well, across the month or across this mesocycle or across your training, it's always gearing up, and then you deload when certain periods like line up. And I think as females, like if we have that knowledge and I guess that understanding around how our menstrual cycle can impact our training, it almost gives us that permission slip to be like, okay, I really need to listen to my body rather than trying to work against it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very important. Then you touched on biofeedback. So for like beginners, it might be a little bit difficult to grasp the idea of biofeedback. And for those of you listening, you're not familiar with what biofeedback is, basically it's the subtle signs and signals our body provides us on a daily basis, whether that be how we're feeling from a digestive perspective after consuming something, or how we feel after a really hard training session or after a crappy night's of sleep. Those are the indications that our body is providing us that we need to tune in and maybe potentially make some adjustments with regards to our nutrition, training, health, or overall habits. Anyways, with regards to the topic, biofeedback and listening to your body is a skill that develops over time. But when you really look at the most advanced people who are consistently progressing, I'll give you a guarantee they have a really well-developed biofeedback system with their body. So when you feel like, during your cycle, let's say, for example, you are in that second phase, that follicular phase, and you're feeling like crap and you're craving some sweets or some dark chocolate, go have some dark chocolate. And maybe, pulling back is, the saying I always like is maybe taking a step back is allowing you to take 2 steps forward. You know what I mean? And oftentimes, we could talk program design all day, but recovery is such an overlooked component of program design, and it's half the battle of program design. If you can't recover from your training sessions, it's like you're putting your head through a wall hoping to get results. Anyways, so menstrual cycle is really big. And another thing that's also really big with regards to differences in males and females, it's so funny that we're talking about this, man. So before the episode started, guys, I was talking to Sharelle about TikTok and how I've been posting it on it more frequently. Anyways, there's this guy who claims evidence-based, and I posted up that there's differences between males and females. He's like, do you have any training outcomes on this? And it's so because like in my opinion, if someone's truly evidence-based, they're one, always going to have an open mind. Two, they're not going to speak in absolutes. And three, okay, they're not always going to cling to the research. They use vocabulary along the lines of like, okay, this may be true, or they just don't speak in absolutes. Okay. Anyways, this kid's ridiculous, and I told him I posted literature about the menstrual cycle and the Q angle and anatomical structure, and then he ended up saying, "Oh, I don't know that much about this topic." I'm like, man, if Sharelle was on TikTok, she would go in on you. Anyways, going back to anatomical structure, so there's a big difference between males and females with regards to their structure because of something called an increased Q or carrying angle. So if you don't know what that means, basically it means just like the female joints are a little bit more inverted, I would say, than a man. And that's very important to take into account with regards to exercise selection, because that's going to dictate what exercises may be appropriate for you to program or not. So Sharelle, let's hear from you. What are some considerations you like to take into account with regards to exercise selection?
I think, to be honest, when I look at exercise selection, the first thing I obviously look at is the goal. And I think this is where a lot of biases come in when it comes to training. And like with a bodybuilding physique background, my obviously primary goal is to build up certain areas of my physique to be able to show that on stage. And I think there's like working with women, there's really a massive important component when it comes to training to make sure that it's not solely physique based. I completely understand that we need to make sure that progress isn't just, okay, well, what's showing on the body, because that can be sort of a slippery slope for some women. But what I also try to educate on is that a lot of the big barbell movements, for example, or a lot of the powerlifting styled way of training might not be the best approach when it comes to bodybuilding or physique building. So I think when it comes to exercise selection, making sure, well, what key areas are we trying to build up? If it's glutes and shoulders for a lot of females, especially physique based women who are stepping into that space, I'm always going to bias like a hinge pattern or like a hip extension, like a hip thrust or an RDL movement, and making sure that we can build up a lot of strength in those areas rather than, say, a low bar back squat. So I think it comes down to not only the areas that you want to build up, but then also the experience. And like what I said about biases, I think it's really important to have that bit of mix. Like I have some clients that like to do a lot of heavy barbell, squatting work, and that makes them feel good. And that's going to allow them to be consistent for a long period of time. And that's a really important consideration when it comes to programming and consistency. But yeah, I'm always going to lean more towards my own biases as well, which are, I'm always going to bias like a hinge pattern for building up glutes, as well as sort of hip extension, a lot of unilateral work, making sure that we're training glutes in all of its different ranges of motion. And then as well, like I said, looking at experience level.
For sure. Something really important that you said is that, so a lot of people have these fitness related goals, which are important, develop your physique, make it look better. I'm sure the reason why you first got started, the reason why I first got started is because we wanted to make ourselves look better. I was the chubby kid, 250-pound years old. So I wanted to, impress girls and get abs and this and that. And through the years, what I've found is that, first and foremost, I train for my mental health. And then secondly, there's a lot of positive health adaptations that we obtain as a result of resistance training, like improved glucose tolerance, minimize risk of injury, decrease depression. If I could just pull up the PMID for this right now, I would, because I have it in my notes. But anyways, osteoporosis, for females, they go through osteoporosis as they age, so it increases resistance training, increases bone mineral density. So it's just really important to take into account that we have these physique related goals, but resistance training should be a fundamental part of our health, even if it's not something like crazy resistance training like your favorite person on Instagram or whatever on social media. even if it's going in and dedicating at least 60 minutes a day, 3 times a week, or at least like going on a 30-minute or hour walk in the evening or morning, those are things that could make a massive impact on your health. And, Sharelle, me and you were speaking about earlier, a lot of people like to talk all the fancy stuff like program design and, how to structure my training and what exercise is best. And, I'll admit, guys, for those of you that are listening, those of you that know me, oh my God, you know how much I love those types of topics, right? But sometimes it's very important to distinguish how we're communicating this information and who we're communicating it to. So are we primarily communicating information to a more general population-based demographic, or are we communicating that information to more of an advanced population that's more focused on physique development competitors, right? And it's interesting because depending on your demographic, that's honestly going to filter how an individual communicates information to you. So for me, I coach a lot of coaches, a lot of different personal trainers, a lot of different health professionals. So I'm able to talk about the bulk of program design and all this nitty gritty with them. But if I have a general population person come to me, I have to break it down at the most simplest levels. Focus on the lowest hanging fruit. Let's focus on better habits with your health, better sleep, better stress management. With an athlete, more advanced person, sure, those are variables we have to manage, but I don't have to manage it as much as I would have to manage with the general population person. So anyways, I've been blabbering. Love to hear your perspective on this, Sharelle.
Yeah, I think like what we were talking about earlier, even the demographic between like TikTok and Instagram and podcasts, it's really important, like, who you're talking to. And that's definitely something that I take like into consideration, because when I first started my fitness journey, I didn't understand a lot of the information I was trying to consume. And that's just because I guess a lot of the evidence-based community, they do speak to each other in the way that they sort of communicate, and that's totally fine. But when you're trying to help people and trying to get messages across, like, I'm always leaning more towards being like, is there a more simpler way that I could put this so that more people can understand exactly what I'm saying? And I think social media like also shows me that a lot of the myths that I thought were gone are not. And a lot of these, like, weights making you bulky and keto being great for fat burning and like all these sorts of thoughts, they're still very much prevalent, because I come across them a lot in my own coaching, as well as like, depending on what sort of content I'm putting out there, like the audience that you attract. And I think for a lot of the times, we do get stuck in a bubble of who we're talking to, and we get used to our clientele. Like what you said, I'm speaking to coaches, but there's also a lot of other people listening to you that might not be up to that current level of knowledge. And so I just try to make sure that I'm always sort of critiquing and assessing the way that I'm putting my messages out, because I also have a podcast, and, it's incredibly important that they understand what I'm talking about.
Sorry. Go check out her podcast.
What's that?
Go check out her podcast.
Yeah. So that's my two bob's worth.
What's your podcast called?
The Level Up podcast. So myself and Danny, who's my co-host, we have a podcast and we talk about health, fitness, mindset, competing, nutrition. So we do like a bit of a mixed bag, probably similar to you.
Cool. Cheeky plug. Go check it out, guys. Okay, so we're speaking just now about being evidence-based, and I think, sometimes a lot of people could get stuck in the science, and on the other hand, you have people who are too bro-sciencey, and I think being truly evidence-based is understanding some of the sciencey literature, but also being able to filter that out to not only your audience, but also taking your own experiences and really just understanding that there's multiple ways to get to one goal. It's not this better or that better and all this and that, and this exercise is better than the other. And optimal, we always like to talk about optimal. In my opinion, optimal is always a moving target, everything we do with nutrition and training should be adjusted, and it should be dynamic in a way with like the ever-changing circumstances of our life. Because when was the last week that every single day went exactly the same? When was the last week Sharelle had this the same thing for breakfast every single day? I'm sure you don't have the same breakfast every
No,
day.
I don't.
Yeah, that's so funny. So let's hear it from you, Sharelle. In your opinion, what's truly evidence-based?
Well, I mean, like what you said, I think just because there's evidence for something also doesn't mean that it's for everyone. And I think this is very sort of important when you talk about specifically females training, because if you look at samples from a lot of the studies, it is done on sort of middle-aged men. And even in the fitness space, I know, like what you said, like mass research and all these sorts of evidence-based people that are doing amazing things in the fitness space are actually looking at like fitness people, right? But a lot of the evidence that's out there isn't based on bodybuilders or physique athletes or even females. So, I think when you're evidence based, it also comes with a level of knowledge of understanding, well, not all evidence is like practical or can be applied to perhaps the thing that I'm trying to do. So it is about having perspective in the content that you can consume, because I also think you can find evidence for almost any argument that you want to make. And understanding that, if you've got a strong bias towards something, you can probably jump on Google Scholar and find some form of literature to support that.
Absolutely. No, that's so true. And it's even more apparent when going back to TikTok, you see someone post a screenshot of literature that they didn't even interpret. Then you go back and interpret it, it's actually going against what they're saying. Anyways, so going back to differences with regards to males and females for training, we know that, oftentimes females have the misconception that training heavier is going to make them look bulkier. I know me and you, we know that that is obviously a myth. But, speaking from your experience, can you go ahead and give the audience some insight as to how you started actually pushing to lift heavier loads? Was it right about when you started to meet Eugene, or?
Nah, I was definitely lifting heavier loads before I met him. I think I think having a training partner has helped me sort of break through a lot of I guess plateaus or strength plateaus, or a lot of have different perspective. Like you've had Eugene on the podcast, he does have a different way of thinking, so it's great to be able to think more laterally about things and get out of your own biases. But when I first got into training, I did have that belief that like, weights would make me bigger. And whilst that is sort of true, like it's sort of the point of lifting weights is to make muscle mass bigger. I think where a lot of females get it wrong is we have body fat over that muscle that is actually potentially what's causing women to look bulky. And I think, we need to stop using language like looking toned and all these sorts of things that, are just, I guess, sending the wrong message. And for me, like bodybuilding was a big part of that, because I can tell you right now, like we lift super heavy, leading through a show or a comp prep to build the muscle. But in real life, like I'm not that big. And especially when I diet down, and a lot of people, when they meet me, they'll go, "Oh, you're smaller than I thought." And I think, social media and Instagram, like it's a visual platform and we're all confined by this tiny square. So when you're looking at people on Instagram, for example, that you might deem as bulky, it's hard to know whether that's really them or they're on steroids, or like if there's some other form of variable that's making them look bulky in your eyes, because that's not the reality of women that actually lift in a natural perspective. So I hope that sort of answered it, but it's so far from the reality is that weights make you bulky. I just would love to see that sort of die.
Mm. Yeah. Other than that belief, what are some changes you'd like to see in the industry, or some misconceptions you could help break with regards to females?
I think just like what I said, having more understanding about our body and how our, not only our mood, but like also our physical performance changes with the menstrual cycle. And I think just having that awareness there can be really empowering for women to know, okay, well, I can push harder now, and if I need to pull back next week, this is potentially why. I think that helps be a bit more like compassionate towards ourselves when it does come to training, because we are very different. So that's a big movement that I'd like to see, just more education and more understanding, and more coaches like yourself like bringing attention to that, because I think it's such a valuable topic. The other area that I would love to see some change in is just obviously in the body image space, in that, you know, the lean figure is just so heavily rewarded in the fitness industry, especially amongst women. And even though a lot of, you know, we work so incredibly hard to get ourselves in that shape for stage, but by no means do I sort of endorse that that is sustainable, or that it doesn't come without great sacrifice. And I get a little bit funny when sort of people comment on my stage photos or whatnot and say like goals, or they have me as their background, and I'm like, far out, I had to bleed for that. And I don't want that image to be rewarded as normal. So I love seeing this body positivity sort of movement really come out, where women are starting to accept themselves throughout all stages and not idolize one particular model, but more so the person or the role model, and perhaps the dedication or the work ethic that's coming with it. So they're probably the two areas that I'd love to see the most change in.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of directions we could go with this. You know, okay, so one about the body image, you know, I'm sure you could agree with me that there's a fine line between, you know, accepting yourself and loving yourself, and then, you know, just trying to be blind about, you know, a lot of the negative habits that you have and where your health is currently at.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a little clear. Anyways, dang, now I forgot the other point. So okay, here we go. With regards to comp prep, I know that you've been in your off season for how long now?
Well, the last show I did was the end of 2019, sort of before the world went through the pandemic.
So many gains during that extended off season. We see the traps. If you're listening, okay, or go on YouTube, you'll see Sharelle's traps.
Oh no.
Has been paying off. But anyways, okay. So with regards to your off-season training, what are some things you've done, or, you know, some insight you could provide females for really trying to thrive outside of being in a calorie deficit? Because, okay, so this is a big issue that I feel like is very prevalent in the industry, is oftentimes people think the solution for every single problem is simply just going in a calorie deficit. And we look at a lot of the issues in the industry, and, you know, most times people aren't even in an optimal status of health to be in a calorie deficit in the first place. You have to first earn the right to be in a deficit, and that comes with sitting at maintenance and, you know, developing better habits with nutrition, like enough vegetables, sufficient protein, trying to space your meals out accordingly throughout the day so you don't feel like crumb from a digestive perspective. That's really important. So Sharelle, I'd love to hear your perspective. What are some things that have helped you thrive this off season?
Yeah, I think that was a really good point. I think something I always say is stress on the body, and a calorie deficit is a stressor. And like what you just said, you have to earn the right to be able to push your body into that stress state, to be able to burn body fat and do what you want it to do. So I spend a huge portion of my coaching time actually encouraging women to sit at maintenance and to build their calories up, and to not forever just be in a deficit. Like I would say, like, you know, like 80 to 90% of my clientele are eating at maintenance or above for majority of the year, and that should be the normal. Like I think a lot of people are willing to invest money into coaching and all these sorts of challenges and fads and whatnot to in a deficit in a dieting phase. And I always argue maintenance or surplus is much harder to do on your own, because you're so quick to pull the pin when you start feeling uncomfortable. And I'm pretty savage when it comes to, like, we have to sit in that. And if you want to earn the right to diet down, you know, you need to spend a good portion at maintenance, and you need to show me that your body's going to be like metabolically equipped to be able to do the things that we want it to do. So competing's taught me that, and I've learned it the hard way a lot of times, being like, far out, like, You know, if you're gonna eat 1,200 calories forever, what are you gonna diet on? There's nowhere else to go. And you know, our metabolism is complex, so it's no quick fix. And you know, for the majority of the year, I am sitting at maintenance, and you bet like there's portion of the year where I'm uncomfortable in a surplus, gaining body fat, but that's just part of the process, and you can't have one without the other.
You're gaining body fat, but I'm sure you're making hella gains and performance is at its best, right?
Absolutely. Like I've built so much muscle mass over the last couple of years by just pushing myself into like a small 10% surplus. Doesn't have to be super aggressive. You don't have to gain heaps of like, you know, kilos and kilos, but just as, you know, you spend time in a deficit and you give your body, you know, time to adjust, you have to do the opposite. And, you know, for the time that you spend in a dieting phase, you should be almost spending double in sort of a maintenance or a building phase. So I think that that is incredibly difficult for a lot of women to understand because of those things that we spoke about, the lean body being idolized and sort of seeing body fat as being lazy, or not quite understanding that, oh, you know, I'm feeling bulky because I'm lifting heavy. Well, you know, you're going to feel bigger at certain periods. And I think it's really important that women learn to embrace all parts, and that, you know, you're going to put on body fat if you're getting to a stage in your training that you actually want to make a lot of progress. You don't want to spin the wheels like I did it for years. Probably ate in a deficit, didn't fuel my body correctly, overtrained, and I just wasted time. And, you know, if I could go back, that would be one of the things that I was like, God, I could have made so much progress if I just ate a bit more, trained a little bit less, pushed a bit harder.
Very important points. Yeah. So I think a couple things I want to touch on. So I think it's a little bit easier for us to have this kind of perspective because we've been through all the extremes. You know what I mean? How much sacrifice we have to go through to get sub 10%, you know, and feeling zombie mode and not being able to move. And it looks sick, but oftentimes people glorify that, right? And I think it's just glorified because, you know, it inspires them to try and achieve something similar. I think sometimes people get caught up on putting people on pedestals that they forget in themselves that they're able to make that change and potentially even be a better, greater version of themselves, you know? And if that's one perspective I could provide people, I hope that's, provided through this episode. And another thing I wanted to touch on was, the surplus. Even sitting at maintenance to conservative surplus, people think they're not going to be making progress at maintenance. Or okay, like even just keeping your calories at that conservative surplus and just sitting there for not 6 weeks, not 8 weeks. I'm talking about, okay, let's go longer. Let's go 3 months. Let's go 4 months. A serious investment phase. And sure, you may not be visually aesthetic or whatever, or shreds, but performance is going to be at its best. And there's a good likelihood that if you're ticking the box for every single variable that goes to your sleep, to your stress, to your nutrition, there's a good chance you're not only building muscle, but you're losing body fat at the same time. You're going through body recomp, right? Yeah. So this is something big a lot of people take into account. That's oftentimes like why like people overshoot just being in a deficit right away. Like if you just sit at maintenance, you focused on building better habits with your nutrition, and you focused on your training, optimizing program design, man, you'd be surprised how much progress you're going to make. And that's something, that with my clients, I really like to communicate. And even when I get on a consult call with them, I tell them, man, if you're looking for some 8-week challenge, 12-week challenge, I'm not the right coach for you. And I'm not scared to turn them away because that's something that doesn't coincide with my brand identity and my values as a coach. Like I think long term, right? And when I'm working with someone, I always like to educate them, right? Because the more someone understands something, the more inclined they're going to be to adhere to things, and that's because they understand the rationale why. Anyways, just blabbering off now, but your next season is going to be 2022.
No, I'm going to compete at the end of this year in October. So 22 weeks, I'm sort of just starting into prep now. I've been sitting at maintenance, like I said, for quite a period since like 2019. And in Melbourne at the moment, things are starting to ease back up and the shows are looking promising. The reason why, I guess, is with the federation that I'm a pro in, we only get one show a year that we can sort of compete at. So it's coming up in October. It got cancelled the year before. And yeah, that'll be the end of this year.
Nice. That's exciting. 22 weeks. Guys, be on the lookout. Send her all the support. And I'm sure, every prep has been different for you, right?
Absolutely. That's the best part about prep is like you always come in with like just a greater level of understanding of yourself and, better training IQ, and your starting position, hopefully, if you do it right, is always that little bit better. And just for context, I guess, like I am 13 kilos heavier than when I competed last. So, fuck the scales.
Yeah, fuck the scale. The judges don't give a fuck about a scale. The judges give a fuck about a look. You
Yeah.
know? That's something I like to communicate to like my contest prep clients too, is like, okay, we do have a specific stage weight we're aiming for, but the goal is not a specific weight because like, let's say for example, I'm dieting a guy down and the goal is weight, but visually he looks really good. But if I diet him down another 5 pounds, he's going to be too flat. It's going to be really hard to peak him. And is that 5 pound difference going to take away from like that 5 pound difference to get those glute shreds? Is it going to take away from his upper body or is it going to add to his upper body? You know what I mean? Anyways, so with regards to comp prep, you said you're 22 weeks out, and I'm sure you do this with your clients. I'm sure you do it in comp prep too, which is, refeeding and diet breaking. And there's been some chit chat, at least like in with people that I know. There was a new study. It came out of I think it was Australia, University of Auckland or something, right? And there's
About
a study I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think, is it about the refeeds?
Yeah, it was by Jackson Pesos.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd love to talk about this. Okay, so basically it was a rebuttal to the authors about how a difference between groups, and it was a statistical analysis. If you're not familiar with interpreting literature, statistical analyses are the worst, okay? So although it was a statistical analysis, the difference between groups, it wasn't statistically significant between the group that was not refeeding and the group that was refeeding. But there was still a difference between groups with regards to BMR, okay? That's just something I'd like to know. Something else I'd like to know is, okay, do we really need the literature to investigate certain topics if we know physiologically the benefit having a little bit more calories or a little bit more carbs that's still structured in a deep dieting phase when it's an athlete giving it all, not a general population person giving it us all? And like this just goes back to what we were saying earlier, it's really hard to like set studies for every single variable and control every single variable. So this is where understanding how to interpret literature is a damn skill. So this is something I always like to say is question everything, because the information that could be being communicated to you could be communicated to you through a bias, and you could blindly be believing that bias. That's why it's good to just always question everything and just gain a deeper understanding of, all the variables, not just black and white thinking. Anyways, I still believe refeeds and diet breaks are still super beneficial, even though that study came out, and that's just not even literature based. That's just my understanding of physiology and so much experience working with hundreds and hundreds of people. Anyways, I'm sure you use refeeds and diet breaks. Yeah, that's something I'm sure you use to educate your clients. And
yeah. Yeah. And I also think though as well, like a lot of people just look at the physical changes or the physical benefits of refeeds and diet breaks without actually considering like the psychological need for a break, especially because compliance is like the most important thing when it comes to a calorie deficit, right? So even like subjectively with my own clients, like refeeds and diet breaks, having that sort of push and pull throughout a long duration of a diet is so important to be able to, step back, take stock, like refuel physically and mentally, and then go again, so that you're not having those issues of like non-compliance throughout a diet too.
Absolutely. Adherence is important. So it allows you to sustain the deficit for longer.
Yeah.
You don't want to have a night where you're craving that ice cream that's in the freezer, and then, you're 2 weeks out and you fuck up your entire prep. Anyways, we were briefly, and this wasn't something we were talking about. We were kind of just talking about your journey to the stage and whatnot. But I could tell just from speaking to you that you're someone who has stepped through the door. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes when people compete, they hold doing really well on show day. And I'm actually going to stand too.
Sorry.
They hold, doing well on show day to such a high standard that if they potentially don't get the placement that they were hoping for, that they lose sight of what they've accomplished and everything that they've gone through throughout the entire journey. And I'm sure, you've talked or chatted to people that have felt like a certain way after show day, or like they have that post-show blues. I'd love to get your insights on this.
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to like post-comp depression, which is what you hear about a lot, or post-comp blues, throughout like a comp prep, it is fight or flight. That's really the way that fighter part's really activated, and it's a massive process, like a comp prep. So it's natural that when you maintain such a high level of activation and then the show's over and there's nothing, people can drop right down and sort of feel a bit flat post show. And then if you throw on validation to a placing with that as well, then of course your mental health might suffer. So for me, and I've been asked so many times, why do you compete? It's such a hard question to answer. But for me, I just love the journey and the process and training. I love training. So being able to use, I guess, anything, whether it's a comp prep or a dieting phase or a mesocycle, as a learning opportunity and a process to go through, regardless of the result, you'll be a winner if you look at it in that way. So I'm like, cool, 22 weeks. How far can I push myself? Where can I take my body to? What can I learn along the way? How's my training going to look differently? How am I going to overcome this battle? How am I going to improve myself, my mental toughness? I don't try to put too much value or worth on the actual end result, because you'd know, bodybuilding is such a subjective sport anyways. You have no control over the placing, really, but you have all the control over what you do leading up to that, as well as how you respond to that placing. And I think, having good sportsmanship and, all that comes as a part of it. So with competing, for me, I have so many friends that I've connected with through the sport as well. And I gain so much more from it than what a title is. So I always try to reflect on the things that I'm learning, or the person that I'm becoming, or how this is helping me as a coach, or all the other variables or the positives that I get through the actual process or the journey, as cliche as it sounds, rather than the end result.
People think it sounds cliche, but the journey, but it's actually a real thing. It's a big difference between the person who leaves some stuff on the table during a contest prep, didn't give it their all, versus the person who leaves nothing, absolutely nothing on the table, because they're doing it for themselves. They're not doing it for a placement or to impress this person or that person. They're doing it because they want to, you know? And it's really important, if you're someone who, wants to take the journey to the stage, that you identify that internal want factor, because you're going to have to lean on it when shit hits the fan and it gets hard, because the contest prep is hard. It's not a walk in the park. And setting yourself up with that expectation from the get-go is something that's going to allow you to sustain the entire journey, especially on hard days.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. I think we're just about out of time, Sharelle. But I want to segue this into the ending. I know you are working on something. You're working on something. You're working on an app?
I'm always working on something. At the moment, I have like a program out called Train with Sharelle, and it is pretty much my prep to stage, my programming with that. So, I have about 400 and something girls on there training along with me. And aside from that, I also have my own coaching service for women as well, which I work sort of directly one-on-one with them as well.
Okay. So guys, go check out those resources. Also, go give her podcast a listen. Go give her Instagram some love. And hit us with a screenshot of this if you enjoyed this episode. Go into Sharelle's DMs and ask her what she does for traps. And
Oh, no.
I'm just going to conclude this episode. I want to thank you again for your time, Sharelle, and coming on. Is there anything else you want to tell the audience?
No, just, give us a screenshot. Let us know what you think of the episode.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll do it again in the near future.
Sounds good.